there isn't ijtihadi difference between men and women being able, like, looking at each other uncovered, like faces uncovered, and having informal conversations and then posting the pictures of the women on, on broadcasting it on social media. Salah must be valid according to the muqtadi, right? According to the individual person who's praying, the salah must be valid according to them. We should stop being in a position where we feel the need to compromise and give into the problem instead of finding the solutions or removing the problem altogether. Right? If we push and say that non-Muslims should accommodate for us, right, then why is it that we can't push for our own Muslim brothers to accommodate for us in our own masjids?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, again, it's a pleasure for us to have Mufti Abrar Mirza. As you know from last time, Mufti Abrar Mirza is the founder of Darul Ifta Chicago. MashaAllah, he trains muftis across the country. And he is also the founder of the American Fiqh Academy as well. Mufti Sahib, MashaAllah, has a lot of expertise in the legal field, in the field of Islamic law, in the field of Islamic legal methodology. So, alhamdulillah, last time we had a very productive conversation with Mufti Abrar Mirza about what is a madhab, what is a mufti, what is ifta, what is the process of ifta, and so on and so forth. And just to continue off of that discussion, this time we want to focus more on ikhtilaf, or differences of opinion within madhahib, and what are the valid parameters of that. What does a person do in the face of different opinions? Many people might have this dilemma, especially new converts. They might have this dilemma that it seems like there are so many different opinions when it comes to Islamic law. So then how does a person abide by that? How does a person choose which madhab to follow, which opinion to follow, and what are the valid parameters of ikhtilaf? Can a person follow behind or pray behind any person that has any opinion within fiqh, or are there limits to that? So these are some of the discussions that inshallah we'll have today. So just to get started, inshallah, following from our previous discussion, when we discussed the role of a mufti, especially in a country where we don't have, for example, an Islamic jurisdiction. So the word of a mufti and the word of a qadi does not necessarily have some kind of a binding effect. Well, it does for a person who wants to follow it, but if a person says, who is this person and I don't want to follow their opinion, then we know that a mufti does not have the power of ilzam. The mufti cannot force someone to follow basically their fatwa. In a multicultural society like America, where the majority of Muslims, many of them, actually we can say that they don't know what a mazhab is, then how practical is it to expect people to follow a madhab?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa sahbihi ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. First, Jazakumullah khairan for inviting me again. It was a pleasant conversation last time, and I'm looking forward to another one this time around as well. Second, regarding the question itself, I think it's good for us to just challenge some of the underlying premises themselves. So, this thing around most people don't know what a madhab is or such. I mean, first, I think people often do know what madhabs are. They just don't understand its details. Right? So they know the concept of a madhab. They just don't know how the madhab works. Why do they exist? What's the necessity in following them? Like, why are there differences? People don't understand those details, but they know just the concept of a madhab itself. And the second then is that people's ignorance about something is not an excuse or justification to abandon it. So we should be speaking about it in the context of how do we ensure proper education and awareness of madhahib, and not whether we should have expectation from people to follow it or not. Right? There's a lot of people who don't know much about zakat. There's a lot of people who don't know anything about like Islamic financing and Islamic financial transactions. A lot of people are unaware of the rulings and parameters around gender interaction, right? And we can give several other examples. In all those cases, we need to educate them, not drop our expectation that they will observe the rulings. So I think it's the same approach we should adopt from Madhaahib as well. Let's educate and not drop our expectations. As far as the aspect of the ilzam, the Mufti doesn't have the power of ilzam. The Mufti doesn't have the power to make something binding. I think you alluded to that as well. That ilzam, that the aspect of making something binding, has never been in the purview of the Mufti. That's always been in the purview of the Qadi. Yeah? People are expected to follow a madhab, and the ilzam of the ahkam, the ilzam of the rulings, is not the solution. Rather, the desire must come from within. Okay? Qada doesn't deal with every issue. Historically, people, the laymen, the general community, would consult their imams, they would consult their local ulama, their local mufti, not so much of a qadi. The qadi was more for dispute purposes. It wasn't for consultation. So it's always been the mufti that people will consult for rulings, and then will follow those rulings out of their own volition, not because somebody was forcing them to do it. So I think the aspect of the mufti not having the capability of doing ilzam is fine. That's never been the case, and it's not an issue today either. I think we just need to ensure that people are just educated on madhahib.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a very important point about the specific change of approach. The idea should be basically to educate people, not to basically rely on the fact that they don't know the role of a mufti, or they might not know what a madhab is. Does that mean that these things don't objectively exist, right? And I think that's a very good approach. But a person might say that when I do choose to follow a madhab, then it seems quite complicated. It seems like there are different opinions, so which one should I follow? And I think more importantly, it's fine for there to be different opinions. We can say in almost every field of knowledge, every field of academia, there's always different opinions. When it comes to scientific fields as well, there are always different opinions. So different opinions is not the problem. But what can we say is a valid ikhtilaf, a valid difference of opinion, or an ikhtilaf that is mu'tabar? What are its limitations? Where the lines that should be drawn? Is it just a person's personal teachers that a person can follow, or is it wider than that? Is it just the purview of the four madhahib? Is it anything more than that? What about within the madhab? There are different opinions. Then what should be the valid? Or if we can say that there's a line for valid ikhtilaf, then what would the lines be?
Okay. I think there's two things you mentioned. I want to address both of them. The first one about people saying this is complicated, this is confusing, there's differences, and we don't understand all of that. And then the second question was around okay, what is a valid mu'tabar, considered ikhtilaf? I think on the first thing, a lot of times the aspect of hey, this is complicated is just a cop out of not having a desire to really understand and learn, where people just lack the interest. I mean, if you take, like people follow sports, right? And multiple sports. Each of those sports, like you take football, it has so many rules of the game within it, right? And each of those like different sports have so many rules and so many exceptions and so on. And people know those rules. People know, like, when in this case something would be valid, it'd be considered. In these cases, like it's an out, it's not a valid approach. It doesn't count as a point. People know those details because they have an interest in the thing, and they choose to learn it. Right? They follow it, they read on it, they watch it, they do whatever, and they become very knowledgeable of all those intricacies of each of those sports. I think for the madhahib, it's not something that is beyond like one's capability to understand, or something that we're going to ask, that it's something that is at a very high level that is very difficult to comprehend. It's just a matter of sometimes a lack of interest just makes a very high level cursory look at it and then say, this seems all very complicated, right? So I think that's one thing. The second question that you have about, well, where there are differences, what is considered as a valid ikhtilaf? And so when we're talking about ikhtilaf, we're talking about we acknowledge ikhtilaf in ijtihadi matters, right? Those items that are within the scope of ijtihad, whether it was, like classical differences of opinion that existed between the mujtahids, between the different madhahib, right, between Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, and so on, or their contemporary issues that are not clearly established from the nas, they're contemporary issues that we would consider as ijtihadi issues, and there's difference of opinion between qualified muftis. Okay? And it doesn't matter whether those mujtahids or whether those qualified muftis came from one part of the world or the other, like whether they're Desi, whether they're Turk, whether they're Syrian, like that race doesn't really impact the validity of an ijtihadi difference. Now, where some ulama disagree on a matter, but the item isn't ijtihadi in nature, okay, or it is an ijtihadi matter, but ulama who are disagreeing don't have sufficient academic qualifications, or they don't have strong justifications and arguments for those positions, then in those cases we don't accept that ikhtilaf. Right? So if it's not ijtihadi, it's not valid. If it is ijtihadi, but somebody who is disagreeing from from the other ulama is not qualified or doesn't have valid arguments, then we don't consider that as a valid ikhtilaf.
When we say ijtihadi, what do you mean by ijtihadi?
Those things are not established clearly from the nas, right? They're not clear from the Quran. They're not clear from the Sunnah. They're not things that the Ummah has had ijma' on. There are things that either have always, like from the time of from the Sahaba or thereafter, have been matters where they're because they're not clearly established. They have been matters of ijtihadi differences, like differences between like the mujtahids, those who had that capability, or it's such a contemporary issue that we find nothing clear cut to say this is exactly the same as this or such, where now someone can, in a valid manner, argue that actually this is more akin to this, or here's how we derive the ruling for this, and someone can have a different approach. Right? So
do you think that basically if something is, let's say epistemically, we can categorize it as something that is, قطعي الثبوت قطعي الدلالة, right? Something that is definitively known without any kind of doubt, to be established from the sources of legislation, so either from the Quran or from the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ. If we can know through, for example, tawatur, so then we know it's قطعي الثبوت, we know it's definitively established. And then the second thing is قطعي الدلالة. Is there any kind of difference of interpretation of that text or not? If something is not in both of these cases, if they're definitively, number one, established, number two, they're definitively kind of out of the scope of interpretation, and they're definitively clear in their meaning, then would you say that this is something that is not within the scope of ijtihad? Because I guess the main question is that a person can say there's ikhtilaf about basically nearly almost every single mas'ala, every single case of law. You'll find whether or not they're within the four madhahib or not, but you can find some kind of opinion, and we could say majority of Islamic law there's a difference of opinion. So would that fall under ijtihadi?
I mean, yes, to your first point about if something is clearly established, then it's not a valid. Somebody says that because I'm at work, it's hard for me to pray Dhuhr on time. Like I'll get home, pray Dhuhr Asr together. I'll pray Dhuhr Asr Maghrib together. Like that, we say, no, that's not going to be an ijtihadi issue. That's not a valid matter. That's established clearly from the Quran, established clearly from the Sunnah. Those matters that are then not clearly established, and you find that there's ikhtilaf amongst those whose ikhtilaf is considered. One thing to note is whether it comes to ikhtilaf or whether it comes to ijma and in different matters, you'll find the fuqaha talk about, those who are, man yu'taddu bihim, right? Those whose opinions actually hold value in the sense that like they have the right to have an opinion in an Islamic academic matter. So ijma was never like every single Muslim in the world had agreed on something, right? It was those whose opinions were to be considered. Likewise, in those matters that are not clear-cut established from the Quran and the Sunnah, they're not mutawatir, they're not clear mansus alayh, and they're ijtihadi matters, then we would say again that those who are disagreeing have to be those whose disagreement is actually considered.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, especially nowadays. A lot of people might call that gatekeeping, or like basically downplaying other people's opinion. But this is actually a principle that is followed in basically almost any realm of academia, any realm of knowledge, right? It's like basically, let's say you have somebody who is an MD, PhD, who publishes a paper on some matter, and then a layperson decides to say, actually, you know what? My feeling about this is that, based on my own personal research, I think actually this paper holds no weight, right? I mean, you can say that. I mean, it's a nice statement. I don't know how many people will take that seriously, though, right? So I think almost in any field, whether it's some kind of engineering, whether it's some kind of medical field, almost basically any field, if you don't have the credentials, then you can't be taken seriously. And that's not a form of gatekeeping. It's not a form of downplaying people's opinion, but it's also what you have to prove, right? And for as long as basically the human intellect existed, we've always considered certain people's opinion, and we've always not considered other people's opinions. Otherwise, anyone anyone can say anything, right? So I think that's a very good point that you make, that there has to be basically, it's not only about that there's ikhtilaf, there's some kind of ijtihad, but it's also who is able to do that ijtihad, who's able to perform that ijtihad, and their opinion being taken seriously or not. So when it comes to that kind of ikhtilaf, would you say that there are some kind of limitations when it comes to that kind of ikhtilaf, which is basically done by a person, number one, who has the ability to, who is man yu'taddu bihi, who would be basically considered? And I know you mentioned also that they must obviously have some kind of legal reasoning. If they don't have a legal reasoning, that's not going to be taken seriously as well. But someone might say, for example, when it comes to the issue of the beard, right? You might have that, Syrian scholars versus, Hanafis in the Indian subcontinent. They have, let's say, different approaches. Then would you consider that a valid form of ikhtilaf? Would this be an example of something like that, where you can say they both are part of the madhab, they both have their legal reasoning, they both have their legal research, and we can say that they're both folks that have that credential? So would you say that that's a valid ikhtilaf?
I mean, not on the beard specifically. There's ikhtilaf within the madhahib, right? And somebody who follows a different madhab and does trim their beard or such, we wouldn't, we wouldn't criticize that person if they're following their madhab and their madhab allows for certain things. Like, we wouldn't criticize them for that. Within the Hanafi madhab, I mean, it's clear that shaving the beard is not allowed. No one sort of allowed for the shaving of the beard. Now, within the aspect of how much should the beard be, like a fist length, or can it be trimmed further down? You do find certain ulama who will hold an opinion that less than a fist is fine. I mean, again, this is even within the madhab, it's not 100% necessarily clear cut. Although, like, we can generally understand from some of the broader matters, and then also, like, our akabir have looked at like the different hadith and such. But again, this is where, like, if someone, if they are reputable ulama, okay, and not one or two, but there's a large number of, let's say, of reputable ulama who hold a certain opinion, and someone is following that opinion, then we wouldn't criticize them for that. That is the responsibility of the individual to follow their local ulama. And now, as far as those ulama who hold a certain opinion, as long as they have done it out of valid academic reasoning, not for something that kind of doesn't hold weight, then we would say, okay, that we may disagree, but we won't make it as an issue of saying that these people are like on batil or they're doing haram or so on.
Yeah, and a lot of times also people misunderstand the mas'ala, right? So the point you mentioned about proper legal research, I think that's extremely important, because sometimes, for example, people will say, if one of the big contentious issues nowadays is for example, you have whether a person can eat machine slaughtered meat, machine slaughtered chicken, or should they only strictly adhere to hand slaughtered. Some people will say, oh well, the Shafi'i madhab allows it, right? And this is a very common misunderstanding. Like, what does the Shafi'i madhab exactly allow? They allow basically with one takbir, with someone saying Allahu Akbar once, multiple animals being slaughtered, which is fine. I mean, that's not the issue. Many times I personally have had this conversation where I ask the person, okay, that's not even the problem that I'm referring to. The problem that I'm referring to is, what if the knife misses the chicken? Then this, according to anyone, as a matter of fact, according to the Quran, this is something that is maita, right? It's not a matter of difference of opinion at that point. So I think people will sometimes misunderstand what is the crux of the mas'ala, what is the actual issue that is being discussed legally. And because of that confusion, what they'll do is they'll say, oh, it's just an ikhtilāfi issue. But in reality, it's not an ikhtilāfi issue in that sense. Sure, there's ikhtilāf about whether you can do one takbir and slaughter multiple animals with that, but that's not even the question when it comes to hand slaughtered and machine slaughtered. But if it's not something that is so clear cut, right, it's not an issue of confusion. Something like, let's say photography, or something like moon sighting. I mean, these are some of the big masail. So I want to pick your brain on this. Mashallah, you have a lot of research on these matters. So maybe something like moon sighting, whether someone should follow local, whether they should follow global, whether they should follow calculations. How should, let's say, a lay person, since they see many masajid, they see many imams, and almost every imam will have some kind of presentation for their opinion. How is this something that is a within valid ikhtilaf, and can this be something that we say that, okay, this is valid ikhtilaf, there's no need to criticize this? What would be your take on this?
So within the Hanafi madhab, we have support for both local/regional citing and also global citing. So whichever one someone has adopted, or better would be whatever approach that a moon sighting committee has adopted, that people follow that moon sighting committee. Either one of those approaches is fine. Whether they do go by local, regional, or they go global. And by global we mean like genuine global, not specific countries or such, right? Like genuinely global. Both of those are established. Now, in terms of calculations, then at least within the madhab, that's not a valid ikhtilaf, right? If someone wants to establish it as a valid ikhtilaf, then they can establish that this is a valid view within their madhab, meaning not in the Hanafi madhab, but within another madhab. And if they do, then if they establish that calculations is a valid approach in their madhab, then we will accept that, okay, there's an ijtihadi difference. It's not in our madhab, it is in their madhab, and we'll accept that as an ijtihadi difference. But the burden is on the one making the claim, right? So I don't feel the need to take it upon myself to establish that calculation is a valid approach. Whoever wants to claim it must establish that. If someone wants to prove that the word witness, right, in the Quran words, فَمَنْ شَهِدَ مِنْكُمُ الشَّهْرَ فَلْيَصُمْ وَمَنْ شَهِدَ, right, to whoever witnesses, that word witness, or the word cite in the prophetic statement, sumu li ru'yatihi, fast for its citing. If someone wants to argue that the word witness or the word cite really mean or can mean that it's conjunction somewhere around in the globe, on the globe, and at local sunset the angle between the sun and the moon should be at least 8 degrees, and the moon should be positioned at least 5 degrees above the horizon. If they want to argue that the word witness or the word sight has the capability to carry this meaning, then they need to make a really compelling case for why those words carry these potential meanings. I haven't really seen that compelling case. So I'm not of the opinion of that being a proper approach. But again, if someone wants to establish how that can be the case, or they can establish that within their madhab, this is fine, then they can do so. I just haven't seen it, and it is not, at least within the Hanafi madhab, a valid approach.
What if somebody says that, this is Tajuddin al-Subki's opinion, that was his research, and he is, a faqih within the Shafi'i school, and if this person is Shafi'i and he says that's the opinion that I want to follow, then is that something that would be valid ikhtilaf?
I mean, within the Shafi'i madhab as well, they've got principles of ifta, right? So something that is not the rajih, the dominant view within the madhab, the Shafi'i Mufti cannot give fatwa on that. Now, the individual Shafi'i person may practice on potentially a view that is not rajih in their madhab, but is not shadh, like it's not like an isolated opinion either. But that would be for that person's individual practice. And this again is the Shafi'i madhab. Within the Hanafi madhab, like neither the individual nor the Mufti will act upon a view that is not the dominant view. Within the Shafi'i madhab, an individual may act upon a view that is not the dominant view, as long as it's not, an isolated shadh opinion either. But the Shafi'i Mufti cannot give fatwa on that opinion. And by extension, somebody who's acting, in the capacity of a qadi, or acting in the capacity of, of a board that is going to declare the month, that then the broader community is going to then follow and adopt that, then you can't make isolated opinions or even the non-dominant opinions a basis for that.
Yeah. And, just to pick your brain on something like photography, is this something that is, within the realm of valid ikhtilaf or not? I've even heard certain people say that it's a matter of aqeedah, actually, because you don't find within the first generations, you don't find anyone that permits, something like photography or tasweer, if we can say more particularly, and that would include something like, drawing someone's face. That would include things like sculptures, but it would also include things like, taking pictures with the person's camera, or, basically videography would also be included in there, of obviously living beings. So would you say that that's something that is, something of a valid opinion? And again, like I said, some would even argue that it's a matter of aqeedah, because within the first generations, we don't find a single example of anyone that allows tasweer. So what would be your take on this?
Look, I would say that people can be passionate about certain fiqh rulings, but again, like we have to be fair and just in academic discussions. Like academic honesty is important, regardless of how much ever we may feel passionately about a particular opinion. In the matter of tasweer, like this has been an ikhtilaf from like within the Madhaahib, right? That in like the Maliki madhab, for example, like the aspect of whether it has a shade or not is considered. Like this is not just a purely contemporary issue. Like yes, there's contemporary angles to it, but the issue of tasweer has been a matter of ikhtilāfi difference, ijtihaadi difference. When as it pertains to like sculpting something, then we would say that is haram, as opposed, in the case of actually drawing animate objects, we would say that is not permissible either. Okay? Now then, when it comes to some of the modern, relatively speaking, modern inventions and kind of uses where, for example, if someone is taking a picture, then in those cases, like we do see differences of opinion where some of our ulama have made the difference between a picture that is printed versus a picture that is digital and not printed. Okay? They made a difference within that. Some of the other ulama even make a difference between something that is just like, even if it's printed, like, is it considered as you like capturing something that exists versus you actually like creating something? Like there is difference there. There's differences between something being recorded. Like ulama have made differences between something that is recorded versus something that is live streamed. So we do find like ulama disagree on the matter, and there isn't something clear cut on it. And yes, we may adopt a certain opinion. And remember, like in differences of like ijtihadi matters, it's not that a person believes that every opinion is correct. Like this, I think one of the things that we spoke about last time, right? We don't believe that every opinion is correct. The matter of, in the matter of fact, in an ijtihadi difference is that you do believe that the opinion that you are adopting is the correct one, and the other opinions are incorrect. Right? This is what the Prophet in the famous hadith on ijtihad mentioned, that the one who, the musib, that the one who gets it correct will get 2 rewards, and the mukhti, like the one who makes an error in their ijtihad, will still get 1 thawab. Like there is in ijtihadi difference a correct opinion and an incorrect opinion. What there isn't in an ijtihadi difference is haqq and batil. You do not have haqq and batil in ijtihadi differences. You have sawab and khata. You have correct and incorrect. So a person may feel that the opinion that I'm going by, which is all pictures are haram, or it's only printed pictures are haram, or only live stream is permissible, everything is haram. Like whatever opinion that a person may follow, they can be fully convinced that is the correct opinion, and any other argument someone is arguing is incorrect. We're not saying you should believe every opinion is correct. The ijtihad difference actually does not demand that. But sawab and khata should not be made into like haqq and batil. It's not a matter of aqidah here. It is a matter of a fiqhi difference of opinion.
Okay, Jazakallah khair for that. I think that clarifies a lot. The third issue of contention that I want to pick your brain on about is the issue of ikhtilāf, basically the mixing of genders. This is something that also has become a kind of widely discussed opinion, and it's not an issue that is only discussed in North America, but almost basically everywhere in the Muslim world, right? Wherever you find Muslims, this is more or less of an issue, right? We can say that obviously there are certain areas, like for example, maybe in the Indian subcontinent, especially in areas where they adhere more strictly to the deen, they have more strict segregation, separation of the genders, and other places throughout the world that follow them will also observe that. But then you might find other places where this is not even a discussion, right? In maybe certain masajid in the Caucasus, in the Balkan regions over there, this might not even be like, who's even talking about this, right? Like I didn't even know this was an issue, for example. This might be someone's approach. So of course, more or less, you have these kind of wide ranges of how much of a difference of opinion it is. But I want to pick your brain on this. Would this be something that is within the realm of valid ikhtilaf? Some might say that, mixing of genders happen nonetheless. People go to universities and they have classroom settings in which they're kind of, it's a closed environment. It's not a public environment. They're also, you have Muslim men, you have Muslim women that are sitting there. So there's some kind of ikhtilāf happening there. Then you have the issue of masajid. You have the issue of Islamic institutions. Why should we adopt a kind of different legal approach when it comes to, religious spaces? If there's already people mixing, people have da'wats, people have invitations at home. They're already, mixing in those settings. I'm not obviously talking about what is ideal. What should a person that is, mutadayyin, that is adhering, properly to the deen, what they're adopting. I'm just saying many people might say that I already do this in other areas of my life. Why should it be any different when it comes to, the masjid? And then someone, just the last point I'll mention that inshallah you can address is some might have this contention that in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, they did not have any barriers in the masjid. And so you had the women at the back, you had the men at the front, but nonetheless, there was no barrier. And the Prophet ﷺ taught, for everybody. And so why should we put up barriers now? Why should there be any kind of strict gender segregation now? So what would be your take on this? Is this something that is, obviously I'm sure that there are many misunderstandings that people have on this issue. So I would like for you to, clarify this for the audience, and also mention whether this would be under valid ikhtilaf or invalid ikhtilaf.
Yeah. Both men and women have responsibilities, right? For men, they have to lower their gaze. For women, they have to cover. If a woman is, covering her face, then there is parda, there is a barrier there, right? But like the fuqaha are not just in our school, but in all the madahib, if you look at the issue, are clear that men and women cannot be fully mixing in an environment where they can see each other, where there isn't, like, the woman isn't covering her face, or they're in a position where they can see each other, like the men can see the women can see the men. Then that is not an environment that anyone says is okay, right? And somebody who wants to argue that for men and women to be in an environment where they can see each other, like, and the woman isn't covering her face, and the men can see her face, and she can see them, then this doesn't fall under a valid ikhtilaf, because those who are introducing this ikhtilaf aren't ahead of introducing such an ikhtilaf, right? Like, look, there are many situations in life where out of necessity one may have to intermingle with the opposite gender, and we understand that just from the practicalities. Okay? And when we're doing so, then we have to adopt the correct approach in doing so. So we have to, there's certain etiquette of how you interact with the opposite gender, whether you're at work, whether you're at school, and so on. And yes, the woman's not going to be covering in those cases and such, and we follow certain etiquette because that's just the necessity demands it, and the necessity is always going to restrict it to its need, though. We acknowledge sort of the realities on the ground, and we deal with them with wisdom and looking at the broader picture. So if a person, that's managing a non-ideal situation, that's not approving of it. So there may be cases where we'd recognize that in a college environment, for example, we understand that most of the women don't cover their face, and at the same time, if that parda isn't there, then ideally you would have then a separate parda, right, with a separate barrier. If the woman is covering, like if all women were covering their face, for example, then you wouldn't have the need to have a separate barrier. But when that's not the case, then you have, when that individual barriers aren't there, then you have a separate barrier kind of that includes all of them collectively. Now, in a college environment, for example, that's not going to happen. That's not going to be feasible. And you also recognize that most of the women there aren't going to be covering. So if it is, if you do need to hold a session, you need to have MSA events and so on. Ideally, if you can do brothers events and sisters events separately, that's what you're going to do. Now, in certain cases, they may be, where they have a program and they have to, for whatever, logistical reasons, they need to have the men and the women together in a single hall, and there's not going to be separation. Then you would ideally then make it such that the men are seated in the front, the women are seated in the back. Okay? And now the scholar who goes there recognizes that that's not an environment that they can control, and they will manage to that non-ideal circumstance, right? They're not going to refuse to attend, but they will attend, and they will be mindful of their gaze, and they will kind of manage the situation to the best of their ability.
And you would say that's on the basis of maslaha, right? Like basically that the principle in the legal maxim, the qaida fiqhiyya that we follow, is that basically the maslaha here, it outweighs the madara. The manfa'a here outweighs the madara. For the scholar to go and speak to that audience, that is more beneficial than the kind of lesser harm that is present. And obviously in that case, of course, the scholar should make clear what their position, what their opinion on the matter is, at least to the organizers, and also maybe not promote it, right? Like, so maybe not, because obviously the audience might know, but if, for example, it's being recorded and it's being put out in the public, then it's not exactly clear to the viewers online that this scholar holds a particular opinion. So maybe it's better also for them not to record it, because that would be some kind of promotion as well, right? Would you agree with that?
I mean, if they want, they can clarify the situation, right? But the thing is that you're going to, if a person attends such a program, okay, that is not an environment that you control, but in environments that are in your control or that you have significant influence over. So it is your institution, it is a masjid where you are the imam and you have control and such. Then we would implement that which is within the Sharia, according to the Sharia, according to the spirit of the Sharia. right? So we would have separation, we would hold programs in a certain manner. And now when that person is going out, right, then if they want, they can make the clarification, but people will also know that this imam, at his institution, at his madrasa, at his masjid, when they hold the programs, they hold it in this manner. And now when he's speaking at this other event where there isn't a parda, like we understand that, okay, that is just the nature of that event. Or even it's not even just a college, it could be like even certain other masjids may have different types of setup, but a person will know, people can see that this person, their regular practice is this. Now when they went to this other environment, then it was a different setup than how they have. The issue is that, are we implementing the proper setup when the things are under our control, right? The problem with some of the organizations we see is that they simply don't want to put any separation or any curtain, barrier, parda between the genders, knowing that there isn't the individual parda, so like the collective single parda, they don't want to necessarily put that either, and they want that mixed environment for whatever arguments that they put for that. And you also see that it's not just that there's an absence of a barrier between the genders, but you also see casual, informal discussions happening between the genders, which then gets shamelessly posted on social media as well. I mean, this, like, that I think is what we would call out as being improper and not being within like valid ijtihadi difference. I mean, there isn't ijtihadi difference between men and women being able, like, looking at each other uncovered, like faces uncovered, and having informal conversations and then posting the pictures of the women on broadcasting it on social media. That we would say is beyond the scope of valid.
Well, so, some of them may say that this is an ijtihadi issue. It's an Ikhtilāfi matter. It's a matter of just acceptable difference of opinion. And their argument might be that well, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, they did not have any barriers, and the people did come. Women did come and speak to the Prophet ﷺ directly, and he responded to them directly. Then what would be your response to that?
I mean, one is we have a hadith of the Prophet talking to a woman, but like, for example, behind a veil, right? Taking bay'ah, but like behind a veil as well. And again, as you mentioned, a physical barrier in of itself is not a requirement if individually the women have their faces covered. If that's the case, so if the women have their faces covered and the men are in the front, the women are in the back, the men can't see them, and even if something were to happen, like their faces would be covered, then the lack of that physical barrier in of itself isn't the issue. But we recognize the reality, which is that is not the situation. Like, it's not that all the women have their faces covered and all the men are situated in a manner where they can't see the women, and the women come later, leave earlier, and you have all these ways of preventing any ikhtilat. Like, that's not the situation we're talking about. I mean, you can't take bits, like like in matters of qiyas, right? Like, there are certain principles to qiyas. You can't do qiyas mal fariq. Like, your analogy has to hold weight. Like, there has to be a proper comparison, and you can't just take bits of different events, different circumstances, and try to apply it within an entirely different circumstance. If an organization had a rule that said, like, all the women must have their faces covered, for example, and the men are in the front, the women are in the back, the women will come in after the men are in, and they will leave before the men exit, and you create all these mechanisms to avoid informal interaction between them, and you see that it doesn't happen. Now, in that case, if there wasn't a physical barrier, we wouldn't critique them for that. But is that really the environment we're talking about?
Yeah, I think exactly, and the scenario you described is exactly how it was in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So instead of picking and choosing, or just basically talking about part of the hadith or part of the prophetic scenario, I think it is important to also mention, as you've said, that the hadith clearly state, right? The hadith in Jami' al-Tirmidhi, also in Sunan Abi Dawud, obviously with variation of the wordings, but it says clearly, مُتَلَفِّفَاتٌ بِمُرُوطِهِنَّ, that the women were such that they were covered in their cloaks and they would not be recognizable. So of course, in a setting where that doesn't apply, it's easy to say that the Prophet ﷺ in his time, there was no physical barrier between the men and the women. But then if we don't reconstruct the exact picture, if we don't, reimagine exactly what the environment in the time of the Prophet ﷺ was like, and we only take bits of it, then it's not exactly an accurate scenario, and we fall into a fallacy by doing that, because this is a disanalogy. We're trying to make an analogy, but it's not actually an accurate analogy, right? So I think that's a very important point. Now, you mentioned about imams. Now, this is actually, I think, a very relevant and a really crucial question for many imams in America, and not only imams, but also many community members, and we can say even many board members. Now, you might have individual imams, individual board members that hold certain opinions. So they might say that we follow local/regional or a global moon sighting, proper application of global moon sighting, and we don't want to, let's say, follow calculations. They might also say that we want to recreate the environment at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and maybe engender more strict measures of separation, gender separation. That's their own personal opinion, but then the institution or the masjid or the organization might disagree with that. Now, my question is that if for the sake of unity, is it something that can be done for some of these imams or some of these community members, that for the sake of unity, they basically follow what the majority of the community follows? Is there any kind of basis for this?
I guess one is, like, if the majority of the community, like if we're talking about what the majority of the community members, individual community members want, then in that case, as a matter of principle, in the majority, Imam yu'tamma bihi, right? The Prophet mentioned the Imam has been appointed so that he is followed. The Imam doesn't follow the community follows the Imam. So the Imam has the responsibility to put forth what is, to his best ability, what he feels is the correct academic view on a particular matter, and his community members are meant to follow him in that. The Imam doesn't, like, the deen isn't like democratic vote. You say how many people want moon sighting, how many people want calculation. We say majority wins here. Like, that's not the role of the Imam. The Imam has to be the one who puts out the view to the community, and the community's responsibility is, you've appointed him as the Imam, now you have to follow him in that. And so that's one. Like, within the masjid, although a person may have pushback from community members, which is wrong, like, they shouldn't do that. They should follow the Imam, but it is the Imam's responsibility to be the one who puts out what the religious path should be that the community follows. Now, then you have within, you have from the individual person's perspective, where you say, okay, an individual person may be in a community where the masjid follows, a certain approach, calculations, for example, or such, where, like, that is what the masjid does, that is what the entire community does. It's not like there's other masajid that do it differently that he can follow with them. Like, he would be the lone person out, right? Him or her and just a handful of people would be the lone people out, and the rest of the entire community is doing it in a particular manner. Then that's where we would say that, what many of the seniors have mentioned is that in that case, the person, instead of being disunited and creating issues, should follow what the masjid is doing, right? The Eid is meant to be, for example, done with the community. It's not an individual event. It must be done with the community. And there's examples in the books of fiqh about what happens if a person sights the moon, but his sighting is rejected and so on, right? But there are cases where you do want to ensure that the community goes together. That's on that individual person's individual practice, while they, in parallel, speak to the Imam or try to have the Imam go down a different route. But those are kind of separate matters.
Okay, so just in a kind of short form, what would you tell this person? I mean, I think it's important that you did dichotomize between the situation where a person doesn't have any other options versus they do have other options, like they can go to a nearby masjid that maybe adheres to what they deem more correct. But what if the person doesn't have that option? What if, that's the big main masjid in their community, that's the only masjid, and that's what they have to follow? Or if they want to pray Eid Salah, then that's the masjid that they have to attend Eid Salah. And similarly, I mean, the next best option for them would be to drive like maybe 45 minutes or an hour and go to a masjid that, adheres to their opinion. And the other scenario is the imam. I mean, of course, ideally, there should be the person that leads the community. And of course, they're the one that is the most knowledgeable. But we also know that, they have a community that writes their checks. So should this person, leave that position and go to another masjid, or maybe, they're just going to be unemployed? What should they do in that scenario? Like both of these scenarios, we can say that it will create a difficulty for them to adhere to that which they deem correct. So for the sake of unity, is there any room, any kind of basis when it comes to, I'm talking purely not from necessarily like what is easy for people, but from a fiqhi academic perspective, is there any basis for them to, follow that which the majority of the community is following?
So for that first scenario, that individual who, the only, like all the masjids in their locality are following something, and there's no really other option, then in that one we do say that that person can just follow the community, because to be united with that community is better than not doing Eid with them and not, kind of creating a separate friction or creating separate fitna within the community in that sense. That we say that that person can follow, although, yes, we say that from an academic perspective, like that doesn't seem to be the stronger opinion. However, that would be better than just kind of completely cutting off from the community. This is what the fatwa elders as well. In terms of like that imam, I think there is a few things to consider here. And one, we should also clarify that we're not talking about principle here. We're talking about like exceptional, extenuating circumstances, and extenuating circumstances are never the basis of a rule, right? They're by definition exceptions from the rule. So we have the rule, and now we're talking about the exception from the rule, where someone is in a particularly difficult situation. One, I think, in general, as much as possible, somebody who's entering into a contract in masjid should try to see if they can, as part of their contract, have it such that any religious matters are their decision and not the decision of the board. Right? So, who gives khutbah, what topics are covered, like what do they do in terms of moon sighting and things of these nature. Like these religious decisions should be the scope of the imam, not the community. So contractually, they should try to make sure that they have it is their say. Now, separate from that, if it is that a person feels that if they come into a community and they try to make this big shift, it's going to cause a lot of fitna in the community, it's going to cause a lot of issues, then in that case, as an individual case by case matter, they may decide that at the moment they need to maybe still do some pre-work, lay some groundwork before the community is ready to shift, right? We see this even from the sunnah of the Prophet, the seed of the Prophet, that there are certain things the Prophet wanted to do, but he said just the community isn't ready for that, right? In terms of, like, for example, with the Kaaba and the creating of the two doors of the Kaaba and such, the Prophet, and including the hijr within the Kaaba, the Prophet mentioned that had the community still not been somewhat new to Islam, right, the Prophet acknowledged the realities of the ground, saying that here's an ideal change, but the community just isn't ready for that yet. Like, this isn't the right time for that. And I think same thing, that the imam in that individual case by case matter may decide that I want to move the community to this, down this path, but I still need to lay some more foundations before I get to that. Otherwise, it's just going to cause a rebellion and fitna. And the imam may then kind of factor in broader matters, right?
Yeah, I mean, is this a good analogy though? Because I'm thinking the Prophet
So,
ﷺ is the legislator, so like he has the room to decide like whether something will be law or not. I mean, obviously Allah Subhanahu wa Taala is the legislator, but the Prophet ﷺ is the one that expresses that, and so he has the option to say whether this will be law or not, as opposed to the Imam. The Imam, the Sharia has already been set for him, and you know it's not really within his purview, like whether a community is ready for something or not. Of course, there's lessons of da'wah, lessons of hikmah that he should adopt from the seerah. But otherwise, I mean, the law is not within his control. So what I'm wondering is like, if we say that on the valid of unity, on the basis of unity, an imam, if he doesn't have any other option, then you know, for the sake of unity, he should follow his community, even on something that he might seem that to him that is not valid ikhtilaf. And similarly, also a community member who does not have any other option but to go to the masjid, that's their nearest masjid, and also he does not see it as some kind of valid ikhtilaf, then if we say that they follow the community for this, for the basis of unity, then what is the Shari'i argument for this? What is the fiqhi argument for this? Whether it's on a kind of usul al-fiqh basis, whether it's from the Quran and Sunnah, or whether it's on usul al-ifta, what would be your argument for that?
yeah. I mean, the example is not from a perspective of qiyas and more from a perspective of nadhi, right? It's just an example to help understand, not that it's the basis of any ruling there. Look, we do have cases in our books that talk about, you know, even if someone has cited the moon, but let's say that it's not accepted, okay, then they're not going to do their own Eid. They're going to do Eid with the community. Right? In certain cases, that the community, the overall community's unity and the community's kind of being together is going to be given weight over like a person's individual rights or such, right? In the cases where, if that's one thing. Second thing also to note is, you know, when we talk about what we follow and like believing that what we follow is a sawab and the other opinion is the khata. But again, in those matters that are not clear cut in that sense, we say that we believe that our opinion is the correct opinion with the possibility of an error, and the other opinion is incorrect with the possibility of being correct, right? And it's based on that possibility that we say, if there is a darura and there are basically extenuating circumstances, then outside of the rule as an exceptional basis, then there is scope to follow the other opinion. ولا يجوز بالضاع في العمل ولا به جاب من جاء يسلو إلا ليعمل له ضر أو من له معرفة مشهورة. Ibn Abdin rahimahullah mentions about in his Nazm about the principles of Ifta, says that, you know, you don't give anybody an opinion based off of the marjuh, the view that is not the dominant view, right? On a weak view, you don't practice on it, you don't give fatwa on it, except for that person, you know, who has some darura, then they can act on it, right? Or you can give a fatwa for that individual to act on it. This would not be like the overall fatwa for everybody. It would be in that specific circumstance. So likewise, we would say, if you're going to say, okay, here's an extenuating circumstance of a person, that imam is in a position, they don't have the capability to shift the imam, that's what everyone in the community is doing, a person simply cannot do what he believes to be sawab in that case, then there is a capability to say, look, here's other ulama who, you know, hold this opinion, hold this view. Generally, according to them, it's you know, that person, it's khata, it's incorrect. However, he says, if they want to follow the view of those imams who are saying this, then they can follow that. Okay? And that's where we say, okay, based off of the darura and such, there is scope. But again, the person will make an effort to not just make that as the default forever. They should make an effort to try to bring the community toward what they believe to be the correct and the stronger view.
On that note, I'm wondering, what would you say about iqtida al-mukhalif, like for a person basically to follow in Salah, they follow somebody of a different madhab. So you might have for example, a person who is Hanafi, and they're praying behind someone who is Shafi'i or Hanbali. And for example, you have the example of witr in Ramadan, right? So the Imam prays 2 and 1, where for example the Hanafis would not allow what we call Salatul Butayrat, right? Basically a 1 rak'ah, 1 unit prayer does not exist within the Hanafi school. So then what would they do? For example, in the Haram, there are certain ulama that have given fatwa, Hanafi ulama that have given fatwa that it is permissible to follow the Imam in those scenarios. Similarly, for example, you have a Shafi'i who is a musafir, and he for them it's obviously a rukhsa for them to do qasr, to basically shorten their salah as a musafir, as a traveler. That's something that is a rukhsa. That's something that they can choose not to follow. So they end up completing 4 rakat of prayer. So then to follow somebody like that. So when it comes to iqtida al-mukhalif, what exactly? Similarly, for example, a very famous issue, for example, when it comes to Ramadan and Taraweeh, is you have somebody who opens the Mus'haf and reads directly from there. As we know, in the Hanafi school, a person cannot interact with something that is outside of Salah. Any kind of interaction with something that is outside of Salah validates this person's prayer. So then you might have a person who is leading Taraweeh, and someone gives him a correction from behind, but he's looking within the Mus'haf. And so we know that within our books of fatwa, that is mentioned as a nullifier, as something that invalidates the prayer. So I mean, or you might even have an imam who is reading straight from the Mus'haf, and you have many Hanafis that are praying behind. So in those scenarios, and then likewise you might have for the other schools, for the Shafi'i and the Hanabila and the Malikiyya, you might have certain opinions that might be invalidators, right, for them. And so in those scenarios, what does a person do? Is iqtida al-mukhalif valid? It seems like there could be 2 positions on this. One is that you would consider the muqtadi's madhab when it comes, or his basically the follower, his madhab would be considered, or the other one is the imam's madhab should be considered. So which one should we do, or is there some kind of way to reconcile the 2?
So there's a lot. There's a lot there. I think starting from perhaps the highest level, from the principle, which you mentioned toward the end about, are we considering the validity of the salah from the perspective of the muqtadi, the one who's praying behind the imam, or from the perspective of the imam? Now that itself is one of those matters within the madhab that has a difference of opinion. The majority of the Hanafi fuqaha have held that the salah must be valid according to the muqtadi, right? According to the individual person who's praying, the salah must be valid according to them. This is the opinion of the vast majority of the Hanafi ulama, from Qadi Khan and Sahib Hidayah, Imam Marghinani, all the way down to like Ibn Humam, Imam Shurmbulali, Imam Tahtawi, Ibn Abidin, rahimahullah, and the majority of the view of our Akabir as well. I think Ma Tanvi, Ma Zafar Uthmani, Kifatullah Dahawi, rahimahullah, like most of the Akabir have also held this opinion. However, there is a view in the madhab as well that says that as long as the salah is valid according to the imam, that it should be fine. And that, although it's not the view of the majority, it is still a view of some who hold a lot of weight in the madhab, like Imam Abu Bakr Jassas al-Razi, or Abu Ja'far al-Hindwani, Imam Sirajuddin Qari al-Hidayah. Like there's certain few ulama who held that opinion, and their opinion does hold a lot of weight. And from the Akabir, like Abdul Hayy Laknawi rahimahullah, like also held this opinion. Now the difference here in this masala, it's important to note, however, is slightly different than the differences that we've spoken about in other matters, where you have a rajih and a marjuh. You have a dominant view and the weak view, in which case it is necessary to give fatwa and to follow the dominant view, the rajih view. There's another type of ikhtilaf within the madhab, that is a difference between the asah and the sahih view. the more correct and the correct view. Okay? This ikhtilaf here about whether it's the imam's salah that we look at for validity or whether it's the individual muqtadi's salah that we look at for validity, this ikhtilaf is an ikhtilaf of asah and sahih, what is more correct and what is still correct. And in those differences where it is asah and sahih, then it is better, it's better to give fatwa on that which is asah, but both views are correct, meaning either view could be adopted. So a person could adopt the view that we will consider the validity of the salah based off the salah being valid according to the imam or according to the view of the muqtadi. Okay? And as you highlighted, in many cases, it may be better to, or it may be more practical to adopt the view that as long as the salah is valid according to the imam, because the reality is that in many cases the imam is either unaware of the rulings of other madhahib or doesn't care. Right? See, we've always had iqtida al-mukhalif, right? Like we've always had people praying behind somebody of the other madhab. Like that isn't a new issue. That's always existed. One of the important aspects of an imam, though, is that there's supposed to be more than someone who can just recite the Quran and lead salah. Right? They must be the imam must be an educated person, and especially in diverse communities, the imam must be somebody who's mindful of doing anything that creates challenges for their congregants, right? They must be mindful of mura'atul khilaf. One of the requirements of an imam is that they're not either a person or have characteristics or mannerisms that drive the congregants away, that reduces the congregation, that people don't want to pray behind them. Okay? Like that's required for the imam. Some of the conditions, if you look at the conditions of the imam, you will see that it's those that will bring the community toward the masjid and toward the congregation. Not like taqreerul jama'ah is not is not good. So one of the things here is that the imam must be somebody who is both educated and deliberately mindful of not doing something that would be an issue for the congregants. Okay? I think when we take about we look at within Ramadan and within the Haram and the people praying in a different manner, I think one, before kind of getting to the academics of the issue, one is we should stop being in a position where we feel the need to compromise and give into the problem instead of finding the solutions or removing the problem altogether. Right? Like we won't reach desired states if we're always settling for the issues that we have. Okay? Many of those who lead, with their in like that 2+1 format, don't believe it to be invalid if they read all three rakats together. Right? Granted, they may not sit for tashahhud after the second rakat; they may do all three together, but they don't believe it.
Even with tashahhud, like for example, the Shafi'is and the Hanabila, they do have actually without the tashahhud. This is very particularly a Salafi opinion. It's not a Hanbali opinion. Ibn Qudama in Al-Mughni specifically actually doesn't mention even that position. So even within the Hanabila as well and the Shafi'iyya, it is a valid way to pray, just like 3 rak'at with sitting in the second unit. But sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Yeah, but regardless, they do feel that if they did 3 rak'ahs, it would be valid. Right? And if they led in that manner, the prayer would be valid according to everyone. Like it would be fine for the whole congregation. And that is something that we should work toward in a diverse community. Say that, hey, can we do salah in a manner that actually works for everybody, instead of it may work for some, but then it creates challenges for others. Right? Like if someone says, like if someone comes and asks us and they say, I can't pray at my workplace because they don't have a prayer room. We don't say, okay, fine, don't pray, or try to find some space in the parking lot or whatever. We say, go to HR, okay, and put pressure on them to give you a space where you can pray. Like they should do that, right? And if we push and say that non-Muslims should accommodate for us, right, then why is it that we can't push for our own Muslim brothers to accommodate for us in our own masjids, right? We're asking non-Muslims to accommodate in the workplace. Why can't Muslims accommodate Muslims in the masjid? Right? So I think that's one thing to note, is that before we kind of get into how do we handle the problem, like we should be mindful that there's ways of solving the problem. Like you don't have to deal with the problem. You can solve it, right? Not just live with it and see how do I work around it. Let's aim to solve it. Now there are going to be cases where you can't solve, right? For example, you have one of your questions was like, within the haram. Okay, there you're not going to talk to somebody who's going to like change the process for you, right? And we just know that that's not going to be feasible. Now in those cases, like then we do have fatwa that allow praying behind the imams, and there's reasoning for that, and the best would be that if a person does pray behind the imam in the witr, or sorry, pray behind the imam in witr in the haram, then they don't make salam after the 2 rakahs, and that they continue into the third. That is an opinion that is within the madhab, and it would be rather that a person does that as opposed to like completely doing 2 + 1 and going outside the madhab. But that is now like, how many salahs does that really apply to a person per year in their lifetime? Not many, right, for most people. Whereas in their own local masjid, like they can solve for that.
Jazakallah khair. I mean, I think that's an absolutely beautiful point that you mentioned, that gets into kind of like, meta fiqh, right? Like what is the purpose of salah? Is to bring people together. And so the imam should not just be somebody that leads salah, but actually should consider the entire congregation and a way that brings everybody together, because one of the purposes, one of the maqasid of salat is actually to bring people together. And that's why, you have people together, regardless of their race, their social class, they're all standing equally in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's such an emphasis on congregation, on jama'ah, because of that reason. So Jazakallah khair, that was a beautiful point. One last important discussion that I want to bring is, we talked a lot about ikhtilaf, and then we talked about valid ikhtilaf and invalid ikhtilaf, the parameters for those. So when it comes to differences of opinion, what is the ruling of tafsiq? Like at what point can we call a person fasiq? For example, when it comes to the issue of the beard, right? A person growing their beard. And of course, if a person is doing it because they're Shafi'i and they follow an opinion where it allows them to trim to a certain extent, obviously completely shaving, that would not be valid according to any of the madhahib, but let's say to trim. Likewise, also you might have, for example, a person who promotes the non-separation of genders, so in those scenarios where a person does not do it on any kind of valid ikhtilaf, right? They do it on an invalid basis. They do not have a basis from fiqh, not from the Quran and Sunnah. So we've seen many scenarios of misapplication of the Quran and Sunnah. Obviously, it's very clear from the Quran and Sunnah and the books of fiqh and the fuqaha and usul al-fiqh. It's very, very clear that, for example, men and women mixing, speaking face to face without any kind of barrier, having informal discussions without the women being properly covered, and the laws of hijab being properly maintained. This is, there's no room for this within the Sharia. So in a scenario like this, what is the ruling of tafsiq? Can we say that such a person is a fasiq, or in any of these other matters, whether it's photography or any other kind of mas'ala where a person, maybe, they do jama' bayna salatain and they say there doesn't need to be any kind of excuse for that, not rain, not safar, not sickness, nothing, but they just do jama' bayna salatain. Certain people do that, and obviously that is also on the basis of invalid ikhtilaf. So in those scenarios, if a person does it publicly, openly, brazenly, then is there any room to call this person a fasiq? Would prayer be valid behind this person? Would it be makruh? And so on and so forth. So what would be your take on this? And then along with that, what would be the adab of ikhtilaf? You disagree with somebody, there might be valid ikhtilaf, there might be invalid ikhtilaf, but how do you interact with this person?
Yeah. I think it's good to address sort of both ends of the spectrum in this matter. So on one end, you have those who say this is masail al-khilaf, la inkar fi masail al-khilaf. Like, you can't make any inkar, you can't, can't like say anything negative about somebody who's following something in a matter that it has ikhtilaf in it. And then on the other end, you have, somebody who may just outright make tafsiq. I say someone's a fasiq because in this matter that this is not the opinion that they're following, or so on. I think on one end, sort of that first side about like the ability to even make inkar. We're not talking about tafsiq here, we're just talking about inkar. When we say, you don't make inkar in matters of like ikhtilaf, the context of that, the ikhtilaf has to be valid, right? Otherwise, we don't accept the premise that everyone has a right to their opinion. Right? This is a very American, like individualistic sort of an approach that everyone has a right to their opinion. I have a right to my opinion. You can agree or disagree, but my opinion is my opinion. Like we don't accept that in the matters of deen. Like everyone doesn't have a right to their opinion. And where the ikhtilaf is valid, then yes, we will identify that what we believe is the correct opinion, but we don't shun or make inkar on someone who holds another opinion. We'll clarify this is their opinion, and we don't believe the other opinion to be the correct one or the stronger one. Our ulama, rather even the Sahaba in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, had ikhtilaf, and they've followed what they believe to be the correct opinion without doing inkar or tafsiq of someone. Okay? Now, on the other end of it, then, as far as like making tafsiq, the parameters around that, if you look through the examples in the works of fuqaha did tafsiq of those who intentionally either one violated an obligation. Okay, so those who violate an obligation. So, for example, people who delay salah unnecessarily. Okay, where everyone knows that it is wrong. Right? It's not like a matter of difference of opinion. Some people say you can delay your prayer. Some people say you shouldn't delay your prayer. You should pray on time. It's everybody knows it's wrong. Okay? Somebody who's delaying prayer unnecessarily, or someone, they talk about a person who does like istinja on the shore where there is no sutra, there's no barrier, like people can see they're exposing themselves. Everyone knows that's wrong. Okay? They talk about somebody who is, leaving the jama'ah or such, or like things that people know are wrong, or they do tafsiq in cases where a person violates a sunnah, and even then, not because they're simply not practicing the sunnah, but they say it's raghbatan an sunnah, like that person like just is turning away from the sunnah. In that case, they do it, right? So they talk about like the aqlaf, or the person who's uncircumcised and decides to be that way because he doesn't have a desire for the sunnah, he doesn't want to follow the sunnah, as opposed to someone who simply just doesn't do it, right? I think that your shaving of the beard, okay, and again, it's the shaving of the beard, there again kind of falls within these parameters where they say, okay, someone who recognizes that it is wrong to shave the beard, but still does that. Okay, like these are the cases where you see the fuqaha like talk about tafsiq. They don't do tafsiq in ijtihadi matters. Okay, like where there's an ijtihadi difference of opinion, they don't make tafsiq if someone's following the other or the weaker opinion. In fact, like you'll find them clearly talk about somebody who eats meat where a Muslim left out the tasmiyah intentionally. Okay, in that case, they say if that person believes it to be haram, because according to us, like the Hanafi madhab, right, if somebody amadan doesn't say the tasmiyah, then it is haram. Person who then eats that meat while and this is their opinion, then they do tafsiq of that person. Okay, that person's eating haram meat knowingly. But they clarify and they say, but if somebody who doesn't consider it to be maita, right, they believe that a Muslim always in their heart has the tasmiyah, and hence even if they didn't verbalize it, they still had tasmiyah in their heart, and the meat isn't maita, it's still permissible. Somebody who follows that opinion, like of some of the other Madhaahib hold, they say that that person then will not be fasiq. Okay? So you see clearly from them that they don't do tafsiq in ijtihadi matters. So when it comes to things such, some of the ijtihadi matters that we talked about, and I'm skipping my mind like the specific examples you gave in your question, but like the ones that we talked about in the earlier on, like pictures and such, where we say, okay, these are matters of ijtihadi differences. You can strongly and passionately have a view, but recognize that there is a difference of opinion there. Like, those are not matters where you can do tafsiq. You cannot declare someone a fasiq if their opinion is that it is permissible. Yes, if someone holds it is impermissible and they're still doing it, then that's a different matter.
Okay, but if it isn't, so if it's an invalid ikhtilaf, like they don't have a valid basis, but nonetheless there's some kind of ijtihad that they're performing, like there's some kind of basis of hadith or something, and because of that they believe for this to be the truth and for this to be correct, even though it's invalid ikhtilaf and an incorrect judgment that they've concluded, we cannot do tafsiq, we cannot say that they're fasiq because they actually do believe it to be the correct opinion. Is that like, am I understanding that correctly?
No, so if it's either a valid ikhtilaf, meaning that it's an ijtihadi issue, or is not a valid ikhtilaf, meaning it's not an ijtihadi issue. If it's an ijtihadi issue, then someone who's following a different opinion, that is not your opinion, the one that you believe to be khata, but it's not batil though. So you don't make tafsiq in that case. If it's an issue where it isn't a valid ikhtilaf, it's not an ijtihadi issue, then someone's personal opinion doesn't really hold weight in the deen. You can't just say, but in my opinion, right? Like, your individual opinion doesn't really matter. If it's something is not an ijtihadi issue, then like it's clear cut and it must be followed, and you can't say, well, I don't believe it or I hold a different opinion.
Yeah, but that's not the realm of tafsiq nonetheless, or is it?
In that case, we would say that no, this person's view here, like otherwise everyone would just say whatever I'm doing, like that is my opinion, I think that is correct, and hence like no one can criticize me. This is where he said that la inkara fi masail al-khilaf, right? There is no inkar in masail al-khilaf, where there is, meaning that there's a valid ijtihadi difference. But if it's not a valid ijtihadi difference, then there is inkar. Like, we do say that no, this is invalid, this is not a valid view in the Sharia, and doesn't matter that you think it's okay, it's not a valid view in the Sharia. And if you're doing something that all the ulama are saying is haram, for example, then yeah, that would be fisq. A person doesn't have the right to just separate away from the majority of the ulama and to diverge from what is not an ijtihadi issue to just say, well, it's my opinion.
And in terms of the adab of ikhtilaf, can you please give us some advice? I mean, of course, we know that the ummah, there are so many different opinions, and people have their own tahqiq, their own research, and on that basis, sometimes people grow apart. And more than ever, we need the ummah to be united, and especially in North America and the West in general. Whether it's North America, whether it's like Australia or South Africa or UK, we have such a variety and such a kind of multicultural, and diverse community that we live in. Whereas, in other countries, you might find somebody that lives in, and they go to a masjid where everyone says Ameen loudly, or absolutely nobody says Ameen loudly, or they have a particular way of dressing, and everybody's already doing that. In North America, the exact opposite, right? In the West in general, it's the exact opposite. We have a kind of melting pot of people here. So in that scenario, what would be your advice when it comes to Adab of Ikhtilaaf?
I mean, one is like, look, when there's ijtihadi differences, then I mean, you're not going to make inkar, you're not going to like create issues. You just acknowledge that that's the opinion of so and so, that's a valid opinion according to them. However, like in the Hanafi madhab, according to us, like here's the opinion. You won't put anybody down. You won't like hurt someone's reputation or such for those matters. But even where you say that someone's holding a particular view that we would say is incorrect, and we don't think it's like within the scope of ijtihad, right? Look, that person, if you look at a collection of such views where somebody holds views that are not the traditional views, that we think they're not valid ijtihadi issues and such, it's going to add up to like a handful of issues that person may be disagreeing on. But overall, like that person, I mean, these are still like our Muslim brothers, sisters, these are still people who love Allah, love His messengers, like, love the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like, are Muslims, like, want good for Muslims, like, they're not evil people, like, whether, like, it's a matter of, like, the gender interaction, like we talked about, right? Somebody who holds certain views and practices in those matters, we may say that, okay, in that particular matter, like, we disagree and we don't think that that's valid at all. And we may even discourage saying, hey, don't attend these programs where this happens because the environment isn't proper. But that person, that individual isn't evil. They're not anti-Muslim. They're not trying to take people away from the deen. Like, we shouldn't, like, believe that, let alone make comments like that. At the end of the day, look, that person is going to have certain people who listen to them that don't necessarily listen to you. Okay. And while we may disagree in certain specific issues, like, whatever benefit the community is getting from that person is still going to those benefits are going to outweigh, those specific cases where, like, we say this, hey, this is, like, we don't accept this as a valid difference. And we shouldn't take people away from those imams. We shouldn't take people away from those ulama where there's an overwhelming amount of good due to, like, some specifics that we disagree on. When you take people away from ulama, like, you take them away from the deen, right? When you put down ulama, like, people's deen gets impacted. So there should be balance in how we approach. Yes, you can have an academic approach with, ideally directly, right? People use social media as, like, a forum for every discussion. That's not proper. Like, you can have private discussions with somebody, understand their perspective, present your perspective, have a mutual dialogue, and hopefully, like, convince them. If not, then you restrict any criticism in a respectful manner to just that specific case that you don't agree with them on. You say, in this case, like, we disagree with them and we think this is a unconventional opinion, or we think this is not the opinion that is in line with the majority of the ulama and in line with their teachers and so on. But don't hurt their overall standing, don't hurt their overall character, like, don't put them down entirely and make them out as if there's some, a decoy plotted by the enemies of Islam to, like, take people away from the deen or such. That's not the case. Right? وَلَا تَجْعَلْ فِي قُلُوبِنَا غِلًّا لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. Like, you should have proper muhabba for people. Like, that ill feelings for someone overall, when really the issue is a disagreement in, like, a handful of masail is not correct.
Jazakallah khair. I mean, this was great advice, and just the discussion in general, I think it's very pertinent in terms of understanding the different opinions that are out there, and the differences of opinion in general, how to treat them, the dichotomization between valid and invalid ikhtilaf, and then how a person should maintain their differences. Jazakallah khair for all the time that you have given. I think, in general, this is a discussion that requires more looking into and more research, inshallah. I do think a lot of these differences of opinion, especially the point that you mentioned about, la inkara fi masail al-khilaf, this is a lot of times weaponized by what we can call the fiqh of modernity. Like, we will also see, or we can also call it, the fiqh of coloniality. We will always see that, for example, in Egypt, in the Indian subcontinent, when the British got involved, there were always certain issues, certain core issues of fiqh that they presented their own kind of, you can say, colonial perspective to assimilate with their own ways, but present a kind of fiqhi argument for it. And we also see our ulama that responded to those. So you have, for example, Mustafa Sabri Effendi, and you also have many of the ulama in the Indian subcontinent, like Mufti Kifayatullah Dehlawi, Maulana Rashid Ahmad Gangohi, Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanwi, that responded to those issues from a very fiqhi basis, whether it's the issue of wearing European clothing, Western clothing, or whether it's the issue of using microphones. We see that it was a kind of legal battle happening, but behind the scenes is actually a matter of coloniality. And I think more than ever, it's very important for us to, and inshallah we'll have a different session on that, on the fiqh of modernity, or the fiqh of coloniality, where we kind of frame these issues on a fiqhi or fatwa basis, but in reality it has to do with assimilation, has to do with what does everybody else in the country do and how can we kind of become like them, and kind of losing the Muslim identity. And also, alhamdulillah, we must also be thankful in many of the countries that we live in, we have that freedom of expression. So we don't necessarily need to assimilate, right? So I think these are all pertinent discussions to have, inshallah, that in the future. Jazakumullah khair, Mufti Abrar, for your time. It was a pleasure having you as always, and inshallah we look forward to many other collaboration. Just any last words that you have to mention? I know you have the Iftar program. I heard more about kind of expansion that you had, so maybe you want to talk about that for any interested ulama. Maybe just to close off, you want to talk about your Iftar program?
No, we've been running the Adab of Ikhtilaaf since about 7-8 years now, alhamdulillah. So we just had our most recent batch of ulama graduate from the Iftar program, alhamdulillah. And I think that we made like an announcement to some of the ulama who had come for the gathering. So we haven't kind of announced it publicly, but we did announce to the ulama that alhamdulillah we've decided that based off the number of questions that we're getting privately through email and so on, that inshallah we'll be launching our Q&A website, inshallah, so that people can go and ask questions via proper forum. Sometimes I'll get a lot of questions just over WhatsApp and email and such, and sometimes things may get lost in those messages. And now we've got a proper system of messages, questions coming in, being tracked, being responded to. So inshallah we're launching our website, darulifta.us. So inshallah people can go and ask questions on there. Inshallah we're launching in September. It's the official launch with the new academic year. So we'll have new batch of students and ulama who will be kind of ready to answer questions. And inshallah people can ask questions and they can create accounts, ask questions. They can track the status of their question to see, is it in the backlog? Is it in progress? Is it being worked on? That way they have some idea about kind of where it is as well. So alhamdulillah, we put a lot of thought into the website, and alhamdulillah, the end product came out really well as well. So it's not publicly announced, but for those who are watching this podcast, you're welcome to take a look. It's darulifta.us. And if you have any feedback for us, feel free to use the contact form to send. But inshallah, we'll start accepting questions from September.
Jazakumullah khair for all the efforts throughout the country, and Jazakumullah khair for the time that you've given us. And on that note, inshallah, please feel free to like and subscribe if you benefit from our program. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.